warfare is incredibly innovative. Sending out a swarm of 2,000 drones that cost 200 quid each with a hand grenade on them, is an incredibly cheap way of doing it. I went around a street in Tokyo a few years ago when I was a minister, and it was just barber coats, hunter wellies. I got a call from a mate of mine who's good mates of Jeff Bezos, and he rang to sort of say, did I want to be the first member of Parliament in space? Space is about satellites and what you can do with it. The Ukraine war, there are infrared optical satellites which are looking at the ground, which can see a column of Russian tanks warm themselves up at 3 o'clock in the morning before going in.
What was your earliest political memory, and when was the first time that you started to engage with politics?
I guess my very first political memory was when I was at primary school, aged about six years old, I think, and we had a general election. So we didn't go to school that day, but I still went into school to watch my parents vote, and I was kind of aware of this thing.
Because it was a polling station?
Because it was a polling station, exactly right, yeah. And I think Harold Wilson won, and my father was absolutely terrified about Harold Wilson. But actually, wind forward, a number of years, I've not actually been that interested in politics. But my mother was one of the founder members of UKIP, and so she got involved in all of that. And
sorry to interrupt, does she know Alan Sked?
Well, it was Alan Sked who got her into it originally.
Oh, okay, yeah, because he went on to be a professor at the LSE and. Well, he was the start of it all, and sort of everybody thinks about it as Nigel Farage, but yeah, absolutely. Anyway, so I can remember sort of debating all this sort of stuff with her, and suddenly sort of being aware that there was a thing called politics, and of course this is kind of round about kind of mid to late 90s. But my personal interest in politics really came about in the early 2000s when I sort of started running my own hedge fund business, and with another guy, and the other guy was a sort of Daily Telegraph reader, and so he always had these strong views about what was going on, and Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and all the rest of it, and I kind of realised that if you're not immune from what's going on outside you because you're being protected by a big investment bank or by a big corporation that you're working for, you have to start taking an interest in it. And I eventually came to the point where I sort of thought there are really sort of three ways I can go on this. One is I can end up being a grumpy old man boring people in a pub. Two is I can leave the country with my money and go and set my hedge fund up in Zug in Switzerland, which apparently is incredibly dull, no disrespect to the Swiss. Or three, you can get involved and do something about it. And so in the end, kind of around 2002, I sort of got involved. But I'm not a political animal by any stretch of the imagination, compared to a lot of my colleagues who've been, kind of delivering leaflets when they were 4 years old for their parents, and then student union stuff, and so I had none of that sort of thing. I guess it probably goes to show the sort of authenticity of your then move into politics and the interest. And one thing that I find very fascinating is people who started in a career in finance and have commercial expertise. You were elected in Wyre Forest in 2010, but you had a 30-year career in the city beforehand. What sort of skills and in what ways did that corporate background, so you were at Bear Stearns, you were at Rothschild Securities, South China Securities, so really extensive career in the city. What were the skills that sort of enabled you to make that transition and to be well equipped having made that transition?
So if I'm being entirely honest with you, Charlie, I think I was very ill-equipped for politics.
Thank you for the honesty.
No. Well, no, genuinely, because I think what I found there were people around me like Matt Hancock was elected, and Nick Bowles and kind of various people like that who became ministers really quickly, who were super tuned into politics, and they'd been special advisors and they'd been working in central office and this kind of stuff. And I suddenly realised that actually by having not had that experience, I didn't know how to play the game, how to play the sort of the power game, and sort of who to suck up to, what to do. But the flip side of that is that when I first arrived, of course, I'd had the big problem that we were talking about at the 2010 general election was the financial crisis. Yeah. And so, of course, I was coming out of the city. I've been an investment banker for 17 years, a hedge fund manager for 10 or 11 years. I made the joke that I now have the holy trinity of the three most unpopular jobs known to humanity now that I was a politician, and that if I was going to cap it, I'd have to go and be a traffic warden after I left politics, which is, who knows, that may happen this year. But of course, I had a huge amount of experience of markets and investment bank, and that sort of, if you like, toxic element of the financial system as was seen by people at the time. And so I got myself onto the Treasury Select Committee. So I found immediately that I'd been, sort of investment banker, hedge fund manager. I'd done compliance functions in both areas as well as being in the front office. And so I had a huge amount of sort of insight, if you like, into how things worked. And now,
actually more of a blessing than a curse in that case.
It was.
Sort of leverage that expertise, invert it, so that you could take it from the sort of money-making side of things to how do we fix this mess in a way.
Yeah, exactly right. So I had the opportunity to then become a legislator, to actually sort of, as a practitioner, I could then sort of look at the legislation we were bringing through. And it was very interesting because you suddenly sort of understand actually why you have to think about these things very slowly. You go through it quite methodically. And in fact, it became even more relevant when I found myself on the Parliamentary Commission for Banking Standards. So this was when we were looking at how we restructure the banking system really properly. So the first thing we did was the Financial Services and Markets Act 2012, which was the regulation that surrounds, kind of how we run the financial services industry. But the second bit, the Banking Reform Act 2014, was about how we really sort of, deal with the nuts and bolts of the system. And it was very, very interesting. And apart from anything else, it was actually quite inspirational. I found myself for 2.5 years sitting in between Nigel Lawson, who'd been a great Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is a kind of,
sounds like a joke. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Three men walk into a pub. One was a politician, one was the Archbishop of Canterbury. But so we did all that, and actually interesting now, kind of wind forward 10 years, and you can see where you might have got it wrong. And actually, you get a huge amount of experience, and there's possibly going to be, kind of more thinking about what happens to the financial services in the city and all this kind of stuff. And bear in mind, Liz Truss very nearly blew up the pension industry with her incredibly ill-advised budget when it was a year or two back. So there could be more coming, and what I would hope to do in the future is be able to come back not only with that experience of, investment banking and being a practitioner, but also being a legislator through those really difficult bits, because then if you're doing it again, you can recognise where you made a mistake in the past and why you made a mistake and how you would avoid making the same mistakes again.
Do you think that a sort of commercial background, so politics now seems to be increasingly sort of globalised and commercialised world. You have trade deals, you have, especially in the UK, you have the City of London as one of the UK's big economic engines. Do you think that it's like really necessary to have that background? I know you've just explained how it's been a real strength to you, but do you think in maybe just a small way it would be great for all legislators or a majority of legislators to have that that sort of arrow in their quiver?
It's a double-edged sword. To use the battle analogy.
Yeah, no, I like it. I like it.
Absolutely. But where my commercial background completely fails me is when it looks at public services. So when I start looking at things like the Department of Work and Pensions or education or health, particularly health, as somebody who's been in the commercial world, I've analysed businesses and we look at what good businesses look like and how they perform well. And you can see that a good business has the most basic level, has a very virtuous harmony between the interest of shareholders, customers and the members of staff who run it. And when that goes well, you have a good business that does well. Where it goes badly, in the banking crisis, for example, the interest of staff came above that of shareholders and customers. And so you end up getting these big bonuses and sort of, the whole thing blew up. So what I don't understand is how the NHS works. I mean, obviously I get that you've got, patients come through the door and primary care and all this kind of stuff. But it's the dynamics that sits behind that. What motivates people to do well? What motivates the people who manage the NHS to get extra productivity out of it? And this is something which I really struggle with. And I look around hospitals and I speak to the managers and all the rest of it. And I see, it's full of incredibly good, hardworking people who are absolutely dedicated to helping other people. The people who work there are passionate about that, and there's no question about that. But they still don't do very well. I mean, as a business, again, the NHS does badly, and there are various reasons for that. But ultimately, you don't have that. I can't understand the motivation. I can't.
There are intangibles that aren't money, whereas with a traditional business, it's about profit making.
Exactly.
But here, it's almost like maybe an NGO might be a more apt equivalent,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Government's maybe slightly more like an NGO than a private corporation.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got these sort of strange dynamics that make it work. I mean, from my point of view, though, there's an awful lot of stuff that I can get involved in, which is commercial. So I was a trade minister, and I was the Minister for Investment for 2 years, seeking investment, foreign direct investment coming into the UK, and then I also had a portfolio of very interesting sectors which I was looking after. So I travelled the world. I mean, when I was an investment banker, I specialised in emerging Asia, and so now I go back to, I'm still a trade envoy, and so I go back to Asia. In fact, I'm off to Vietnam in a couple of weeks' time. So I'm still doing that. So all of that commercial kind of stuff, where you're trying to bring businesses together, you're trying to make, at the end of the day, governments don't deal with governments. It's businesses within countries that deal with each other, and it's how you foster that relationship. So I get that, and I really understand that. But public services, it's difficult. But the good news is, other people do understand public services, and they don't necessarily understand what I do. So between us all, the virtue of a political party is we can lean on each other when we need that help.
Yeah, and I mean that's very interesting, especially how you have been able to find your niche within the party and within government. Trade minister 2016, 2018, and the various committees you sit on. I'd like to come to cross-party cooperation, which is something that I think maybe we need a little more of. Politics can often be quite a tribal arena, and if we hear sometimes about cross-party cooperation, but I think it'd be quite interesting if you were to sort of lift the lid on the dynamics of and the mechanics of how that actually happens. Is that one MP on one side of the aisle has a particular interest in an area, they go to their opposite number? Do you go through the whips? Do you go through sort of central office? How does that happen? How does that partnership come to be?
More often than not, you spill their drink in the bar, and when you buy the one to replace it, you get on with each other. It's as Prosecco's out. No, I mean there are lots of ways where we get together, we work on things together. So the most obvious one is select committees, and so they're cross-party, and so you all get together. You go on trips, you go from kind of visit things that are relevant to your select committee, and so you get to know people that way, and you for one reason or another you'll come across people where you have a common interest. So the all-party parliamentary groups are another way of doing it. I mean, invariably what happens is there are some people are terribly tribal. I mean, really tribal, and I never quite worked out why they are so tribal. But I think most people will talk to anybody, if you share an interest in, I don't know, sort of motorsport or something. I mean, there's a lot of politics that goes on in motorsport, and why wouldn't you talk to other people? But there is something which I think is very important, which is lost with politics, and I've been in Parliament now for 14 years, and one of the things that I've been very struck by is actually nobody's in it for themselves. If you have a huge amount of that kind of energy and motivation to do well in politics, you do really well in investment banking or in the corporate world. You can, if you dedicated that to going and making money, you do better elsewhere. And everybody here are genuinely doing it because they care about the communities they represent, and they care about their countries. I mean, some people don't mind so much about where they're representing, and some people are more about their constituencies. But ultimately, it's all about how we're serving those people we're voted in by. And that includes the wider country in terms of making sure that Britain is a better place. And I think we occasionally forget that when we're having the political discourse. And the one thing that I find, incredibly depressing about politics is when you start seeing personal attacks on other politicians. And I think the minute you need to deploy a personal attack on another politician is the moment you've lost the argument and you're now scratching around desperately. I was lucky enough to stand against an extraordinarily decent individual who was elected in 2001 trying to save the local hospital. So he was an independent called Dr. Richard Taylor, and he'd been a consultant. There was a slightly sort of complicated story to do with the Labour candidate beforehand, but ultimately he recognised that the hospital that he had worked in for most of his life was about to be closed down by the Labour government, and he wanted to stand against its closing down. Now, he got in with a massive majority in 2001, and I first fought against him in 2005, and he beat me, or rather I failed to beat him, and then I beat him in 2010.
And it was one of these interesting things, and I remember sort of thinking, you know, how on earth do I deal with this chap? Because he's genuinely everybody's favourite grandfather. People love him for what he...
Did he accomplish the goal of...
Not really, no.
No, he didn't. Okay.
He didn't. I mean,
Do you think that's one of the, aside from the candidate I see in front of me, is that one of the reasons you think that you were able to...
No, it wasn't. It was the point is, I could have gone in and said he's failed in what he set out to achieve and he's useless at everything else, and you need somebody who's better at wider things. You know, he was an independent MP and he didn't have the resource of a party behind him to support him in all the stuff he did. But to do that would be to insult the 27,500 people who voted for him.
Yeah.
And you know, if you try and undermine him, it would be the wrong thing to do at a strategic level, but also at a personal level. Why would you attack somebody who had been such a decent person? So what I did was I supported him, but found other things to talk about, which he wouldn't be able to deal with. And you know, wind forward to 2008, and Gordon Brown very happily delivered the financial crisis for us through various reasons, although they would say it's nothing to do with them, but he did write the rules that failed the system in 2000 rather. But you know, so when we went into the general election, I can remember doing a video sort of saying, you know, back in 2001, when Labour had closed Kidderminster Hospital, was closing Kidderminster Hospital, the great Richard Taylor stepped forward, you know, with his knowledge of health and the hospital locally, and he was the right man for the job to try to save the hospital. Now, coming into the 2010 general election, after we've got this financial crisis, you need a former investment banker and hedge fund manager to be parachuted in from London to come along and help resolve that problem. And it worked. I mean, at the end of the day, it was relevant, you know, because the issues had moved on, and I became the right candidate for what was needed at that time.
Coming back to what we were saying about reaching across the aisle and not being not being tribal, I find the idea of political discourse really intriguing. And spending a lot of time in the US, it of course is the landscape of discourse is very different. People are incredibly polarized. People on the right dislike people on the left and vice versa, and people on each side absolutely despise the center ground. So there's no compromise is a dirty word, and it's difficult to come to resolution or even talk about it. And I think that one of the things that we are able in the UK to do very well is to disagree agreeably. And we can go to, you know, we can have dinner with friends, and you can have someone, you know, Conservative here, Labour there, and you can have vastly different ideological outlooks. But over the dinner table, you can discuss it. There can be healthy debate, well-reasoned argument, and at the end, you leave still liking the people. Why do you think in this country we are quite good at that? And could you talk a bit about the sort of spirit of political discourse here?
I mean, political discourse is quite interesting. I mean, you know, at my level, I find actually talking to people who have a different point of view really interesting.
Do you like to be challenged?
I do now.
Okay.
I was uncomfortable to start off with.
Yeah.
But it's something which you have to get used to.
Yeah.
And yes, I mean, it's, you know, if I get challenged with something I'm a bit shaky on, then I feel sort of, you know, lack of confidence. I suppose it's the same with anybody, isn't it, really? But on certain areas where I do have confidence about, then you know, actually challenge is good because you modify and bring up to date your views. But I mean, I get on fine with people like Angela Rayner. I was chatting to her the other night, actually, sort of making some joke about the fact that I might be the next person to come and join the Labour Party, which I'm definitely not going to do.
We have an exclusive. No. I just
but after they managed to bolster their ranks with Natalie Elphig, which is one of the single most bizarre things that ever happened in politics. I mean, you know, kind of, I'm sort of jokingly trying to put the rumour around that Diane Abbott is going to come and join the Conservative Party, which is kind of as mad as Natalie joining them.
Is she nice in private? How
Diane
would you?
Abbott?
No, Angela Rayner.
Angela, she's great.
Yeah.
No, I've always enjoyed her. I mean, she was on the Parliamentary Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme, and so we sort of find ourselves in some officers' mess down at Shrivenham, and you know, and she wasn't drinking Vipers, I think it is her favourite drink, was certainly drinking something else.
Right.
She's a nice, bubbly person. I mean, you know, but she's obviously, you know, very keen on her politics. But I think when you sort of get beyond that, and you get into the sort of the wider, kind of dinner party set, I suppose one of the things that I find quite interesting about it is everybody has something they feel very strongly about, and it's not necessarily the same for each person. And I can remember just before I got elected, I got stuck with somebody who was a pro hunting, and he was sort of saying, this is the only thing that's going to win the election. You've got to go 100% pro hunting, because his echo chamber were people who shot and fished and hunted, and that's all he could see in the world. Whereas, you can talk to other people who feel incredibly passionate about something else, or about the environment, or about, kind of, I don't know, food banks in the inner cities. I mean, there can be any number of different things that people feel strongly about, and I think this is the problem. Is the, from a politician's point of view, you have to talk to people about everything, and actually in some cases you have to explain. I mean, Charlie, you're of a generation that had spent £9,500 on your university fees.
Yeah.
And I can remember doing the vote. I mean, the Parliament was locked down, and we had goodness knows how many riot police outside ready to fight off your chums or your predecessors, and it was quite alarming, and we were getting a lot of emails coming in, but it was interesting, because when you sit down and look at the analysis, then clearly we want people to go to university. Clearly, we'll give people the opportunity, but at what cost to another part of the economy or of the government? Should we pay for that from reduced money in the NHS, or should we move money away from secondary schools into universities, or should we have fewer police? These are the difficult decisions which you've got to make, and sometimes you find when you have that sort of discourse, people can turn around and sort of say, getting back to the hunting thing, absolutely, it's kind of completely wrong. The economy of the countryside does well because of hunting, and to a certain extent it did. But it does well because of all sorts of other things as well. It does well because of tourism, of other sorts. There's lots of things that are going on. And in the end, hunting that we've got at the moment, I suspect under Labour will be banned completely. And it's a
Is that fox hunting or just
fox hunting? Yeah,
fox hunting. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And then they'll start moving onto shooting. And I've never hunted. I've followed a hunt, but I can't see myself supporting keeping hunting. It's one of those things where it's had its time, and I think we've moved on.
I'd like to move to something we were talking about earlier, and one of your sort of areas of expertise, trade. And I would like, if you can, to, in sort of the, a brief overview, we hear a lot about trade deals with the EU after leaving, trade deals with America, other, ASEAN. How, from start to finish, broadly speaking, does a trade deal work? Is it diplomat-led? Is it like trade envoy, like you, a parliamentarian? Do you go and meet with your opposite number in that country? Do you meet with heads of business there? What are the mechanics of how that actually develops and works?
So actually doing a trade deal. I mean, so at the end of the day, I mean, we've since Brexit, we've obviously done the
You said the word first. I mean, I was going to not bring it up, but
so I campaigned.
It's unavoidable,
for Remain.
right?
I campaigned for Remain. Having had my mother banging on about all the great things Brexit would deliver. She died 2013, so she missed Brexit. And in fact, when she died, Nigel Farage sent a wreath to her funeral, and just a very quick, amusing story. On the morning of the funeral director turned up and sort of said, I hope the family's okay and all the rest of it, and kind of mum was in the box outside, and they said, you ought to know, Mr. Garnier, that Mr. Farage has sent a wreath. I said, well, that's incredibly nice of him. They said, well, what would you like us to do with it? And I said, well, put it with the others, You haven't seen it, and basically it was it was dressed up like a UKIP rosette. So it was about that wide with a purple ribbon around the outside, white flowers and a pound sign in the middle with two ribbons.
He campaigns everywhere, doesn't he?
He does. I know, it was classic.
Nowhere's off limits.
Absolutely. Anyway, I sort of had a look at this, and God, kind of what a Conservative MP. I mean, this is kind of quite embarrassing. And in the end, I mean, there was a lot of mum's friends from UKIP down in Cornwall who were coming to the funeral. So I said, look, just give it a nice place, but please don't let me get within photographing distance of it. And that was that. But anyway, she would have loved it. But look, when we left the European Union, the whole idea was we're going to have a whole lot of opportunities to sign up trade deals around the world, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. I didn't want to leave the European Union, but I lost that argument. We lost that argument, and we've got to move on, and that includes doing all these trade deals. So the first, I think, 52 or so we did were rollover trade deals from the ones we had with the European Union. So the EU had a whole lot of trade deals with a lot of countries around the world. So some of them were emerging economies where you had sort of a wider sort of cooperation with them all. Some of them were places like sort of Korea or Canada or whatever. No, not Canada, but kind of various other sort of countries where we had existing trade deals. So we did these what's known as continuity trade deals. So that was basically cut and pasting, the old trade deal and just taking out reference to the European Union and all that kind of stuff. And then we've done a few more. So we did Australia and New Zealand. We've done CPTPP. We've become a dialogue partner of ASEAN, which is a slightly different thing. I think we've just done North Korea,
sorry,
South Korea.
when you say a dialogue partner, is that sort of the first steps of a trade deal?
Or? It is. But joining CPTPP, which is a comprehensive Trans-Pacific trade partnership, that's a more useful thing than necessarily having a trade deal with ASEAN, because quite a lot of the countries in ASEAN are in CPTPP as well. And you can still pick off one-off trade deals as you like. I mean, the starting point is you look at who your strategic partners are. So the biggest trading nation we have as a nation is actually the United States of America, where I think about 14.6% of our total trade is with the US.
Yeah, I think it's about 175 billion or so of goods and services that they buy from us on an annual basis. So pretty substantial.
Yes, and then well I can tell you that there's about £1 trillion worth of US money invested into the UK, and I think the same trillion. He says with
that sounds like it could be, if you think about all the sort of US financial firms and the equity that they hold in the UK.
Well,
companies,
but also
reason.
loads of business. I mean, if you think there are an awful lot of businesses, like Walmart, for example, kind of made investments into the UK. So there's a lot of investment, but we don't have a trade deal. So we pay tariffs on, tariffs are paid on transactions that come between us, and then it's actually even more complicated. So we export. Financial services, for example, but it's quite tricky because you've got to do it state by state. So one of the first countries, so you go along to those countries, you can identify, that's a good one. India is another good one. Australia, New Zealand, they kind of look like us. We do quite a lot of trade with them. All sorts of countries like that. So you go out and you at a government to government level. So this will be, sort of Prime Minister's office type of thing. Obviously through civil servants, we'll then reach out and say, do you want a trade deal? And so you then start the negotiations, and we've been going on with the US for some time, and those trade deals now kind of died a death. We're not going to get anywhere. We're now working.
Why is that?
Because different politicians.
Okay.
Right. So things move on.
I mean, that must be difficult when you have one administration trying to adhere to their criteria, especially taking in ideology to the, as factoring in ideology, and then it switches 4 years later, and you're back at square one.
Kind of politics, and we just got to deal with it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's annoying, but at the end of the day, actually, I think the average tariff rate. So if you look at all of the stuff we export to America, the average tariff rate is about 10%. And the idea is, if you remove that tariff, British exporters can do one of two things. They can either, or both actually, they can either increase the price by 10% and make a 10% wider margin, because the US consumer will still be paying the same amount as they were before. You can hand all of that tariff bonus to the US citizen, in which case you'll increase the demand for the product, so you could do better, so whatever. Or you could do something in the middle. But it works both ways. So of course their goods coming back to us, sort of whatever it happens to be, but we'll then be paying less for it, and then in theory demand more. But at the end of the day, I mean, there's a whole lot of estimates about how much trade deals make, and actually, the argument goes that they're not as good as people imagine they are. And certainly when I was on the International Trade Select Committee, we would analyse these various trade deals, and there'd be kind of slightly disappointing increase. I can't remember exactly what the figures are, but you're looking at something like the Australia trade deal as increasing over the next 10 years, UK GDP by 0.6% sort of thing.
So sometimes they're not. I mean, because people laud trade deals as like these really important things to have, but you're saying that they're not necessarily. Sometimes just
no.
On
the contrary. So people come along, and if you do a sort of very basic analysis, a sort of economic analysis of what the trade deal looks like, then there's only a sort of limited amount of
it's just a small.
But what that doesn't take into account, and we've certainly seen this in other countries where they've done trade deals, is the publicity that surrounds a trade deal makes people who wouldn't otherwise have looked at those countries sort of thinking, actually, I ought to be exporting to Australia. Australia's a difficult one because one of the reasons why we should never come out of the European Union is because a country trades with other countries that have two characteristics, one of which is they're close and the other is they look like them. So America's, kind of just the other side of the Atlantic, but it looks like us. We watch American films, we kind of speak the same language. Europe is very close. They look slightly less like us because they speak a different language depending on where you are. But nonetheless, they're very familiar. We don't, people go on holiday to Spain and Italy and all the rest of it the whole time. So it's very, very familiar. Australia looks like us because they speak, English, but it's a long way to get to, and it's, shipping charges are quite expensive. But then similarly, you can look at the Asia Pacific region, where they neither look like us. They speak different languages, and it's quite a long way away. But that's where the engine of growth economically is going to come for the next 50 or 100 years. So you're going to see super quick economic growth in those areas. And I'm the trade envoy to 4 ASEAN countries, to Brunei, which is quite a small country but very rich, Myanmar, which is very, very sadly in the middle of this civil war as a result of the coup.
Are we trading with them now, or has that
it's
really
very,
come
very
to a halt?
It's coming to a halt. At the end of the day, there are a lot of sanctions against individuals, so it's quite difficult to get into trade. But we are still buying stuff from them. But my other 2 countries, which take up a lot of my time, are Thailand and Vietnam.
Those are rapidly growing economies.
Yeah, well, Vietnam is incredibly exciting. There's 102 million well-educated people who want to be international, with GDP per capita around $4,000, and expected to grow at sort of 8 to 10% over the next sort of 10, 20 years. That's a great opportunity, and there's lots of brilliant things you can do there. So this is where the demand is going to come from, and they love British stuff. I went around a street in Tokyo a few years ago when I was a minister, and it was just barber coats, Hunter Wellies. It was absolutely surreal.
It's like being in your constituency, right? It's like being in the English countryside.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah. So this type of British brands do well, and then of course they have an awful lot of useful stuff which they can sell to us. So I was recently, not far from my constituency, looking around a factory from a company called Seafresh, and where they package. Actually, interestingly, it was a Thai company, but they import prawns and they sell them through Marks and Spencer's and Waitrose and stuff, and it's and these are Thai businesses that are coming to us. So international trade is going to be a big thing, and as I say, you can still do international trade. Being a member of the European Union does not stop you trading with the rest of the world, and it never has done. This was all nonsense, from people like my mother. But we are where we are, as I say, so we may as well do these trade deals and may as well take advantage of the Indo-Pacific tilt, and make sure we continue to grow as a country.
Still on the topic of, I guess, the broad umbrella of trade. You were, from 2020 to 2023, the chair of the Committee on Arms Export Controls, and which, of course, now the UK government is sending a lot of military aid abroad to Ukraine, to the Middle East. To what extent, in this day and age, is it still Britain's place in the world to be sending military aid like that to foreign hotspots?
You kind of word it in a slightly odd way.
Okay.
So military aid is, actually what we're doing is for example, in Saudi Arabia, you talk about the Middle East, we supply a lot of munitions to their war against the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and but we're selling it. We're doing it for commercial reasons. They're a rich country; they can afford it, and so we're.
So is that classified as military aid? Would you?
Well, it's classified as military exports. Military exports, but it's a word aid that's
right.
If you
because I guess what I'm asking about is, for example, in Ukraine, where we're sending, I mean, they're not. Are they paying? They're not paying for those. Are they?
I doubt it.
Yeah,
because
I guess that's sort of the UK's support.
No, I know what you mean. Yeah, exactly.
So I guess I mean sort of in that capacity, is that. Do you think we should still be doing that? Obviously, that's quite a strong example, but just to sort of more conceptually speaking, I guess.
You need to divide this debate into two bits from where you started. So one of which is you've got the commercial issue of is it the right thing to do to sell weapons to other countries, okay, irrespective of who that country is and what they use them for, and the answer is. Yes, within certain guidelines. So we are exporting. We export a lot of stuff. We do financial services. We do cars. We do all sorts of education. We're big at agri-tech, fintech, all of this kind of stuff. We do a lot of exports on. We also do a lot of military exports. And so, for example, in Thailand, we've been exporting some coastal ships, kind of plans and development of those coastal ships, which is a commercial deal. So we charge them money for it. They we help them out and all this kind of stuff in terms of building, but basically we're selling it for money and there's a profit on it. We will only do it if those countries are people that we, there's quite a complicated way that we make sure we're fitting in with the right way of doing it. And there's a complicated process that goes on, which again I was involved in when I was a minister, which basically allows a license for export to be done. And there's a lot of input that comes in from various people. There's lots of considerations in terms of what the stuff is used for. And is there a possibility of diversion or dual use? So, for example, I'll give you an example. Years ago, I think, I'm just trying to remember, but something like, I think it was Iran wanted spare parts for helicopters for their first aid, kind of the equivalent, I think it's called the Red Crescent, the equivalent of the Red Cross. And it seemed like a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Why wouldn't you give parts for helicopters flying into people, who've got, been hurt by earthquake or something? And the reason you wouldn't is because those helicopter parts could be diverted to the Iranian military, and the Iranian military have problems in terms of the fact that they support terrorism around the world.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know if you saw that Nicolas Cage movie, Lord of War, where they have this helicopter being brought in as a foreign aid helicopter, and they don't have the end user certificates, and they have the missile launchers on these helicopters. So they get I think they might have been, I think they were somewhere in Eastern Europe, and they sort of get, last minute, they get some mechanics to come in with wrenches, basically because the sort of international police are closing in, and they take the missile launchers off, and then just say these are aid helicopters. They're not going to an African dictatorship or something like that.
Yeah. So basically, we can't do that.
I mean, I imagine that the sort of microscope is huge for making sure that things end up in the right place. And
and there's a great system that does that. With something like Ukraine, it's a slightly different issue because Ukraine, there is. Ukraine has been invaded by an offensive, hostile country, which is trying to increase its sort of influence over parts of Central Eastern Europe. And what we're doing there is we are looking at this as a strategic response to something. So that's a different thing. So we can't get out there and fight because we don't want to get drawn into this, because then we will become an enemy of Russia. And right now we don't want to do that. So what we are doing is we're supporting Ukraine in their efforts to try and stop Russia advancing.
So really, aid isn't necessarily the right term to.
It's a strategic participation by supplying kit and equipment in order to make sure that they can be as effective as they possibly can in terms of holding back the Russians. But it's quite complicated. I mean, and then of course it comes the incredibly controversial thing of what's going on in Palestine and in the Gaza Strip. And this is incredibly depressing. So we sell about £40 million worth of military kit to Israel per annum. They sell us a lot more.
14 million.
Yeah, it's small.
Okay, so that's quite.
It's tiny. And in fact, as I said, they sell us a lot more than we sell them. So so it's not going to make a huge amount of difference. But America has now indicated that they've stopped a shipment of weapons going to Israel.
in order to send a message that they're unhappy with the way they're prosecuting that war in the Gaza Strip. And of course, we are helping actually with aid to people living, who are caught up in Gaza, who are actually having a horrible time, and these are innocent sort of women and children, and.
On the topic, just coming back to Ukraine, and on the topic of the type of military equipment that we export, that's a really interesting example, because it's probably the first war that we've seen where you've had sort of a large-scale use of really, really cheap drones, and they are all of a sudden taking out $3 million Russian tanks, and drones are a 250 pound, $300 drone, whatever it is, with a grenade strapped to it, can take out a soldier that it's taken however many months to train, and have tens of thousands of pounds or dollars of equipment on. To what extent are the arms that we both have but are exporting still relevant to modern warfare in today's
But you're right,
today's
Charlie. At the end of the day, warfare is incredibly innovative, and it's always been the case. I mean, if you look back to the First World War, the Wright brothers first had powered flight in 1902. By the time the beginning of the First World War, aircraft were pretty basic. By the end of the First World War, just 4 years later, they were getting pretty advanced. Wind forward to 1939, and you had the Spitfire and the Hurricane, and some pretty impressive aircraft. Through the war, kind of in the back end of the 1940s, we were developing the jet engine. We were developing, as I say, when you think about it, the American Air Force was very primitive. I understand, back in the sort of 1930s, and yet they were going supersonic by the end of the 1940s. Wind forward to the end of the 1960s, they got a man on the moon. So you can see how, kind of, and that actually the moonshots were kind of thrown out of the competition through the Cold War. So you can see that any person who's prosecuting armed conflict is going to look very hard to find ways that they can do it in a way that that they can do it cheaply and effectively. And actually sending out a swarm of 2,000 drones that cost 200 quid each with a hand grenade on them, is an incredibly cheap way of doing it. But even the Russians have been quite innovative, and they have these glide bombs. They have these rather big bombs. They just weld wings onto them, and they drop them, and they can glide 200 miles or something, whatever it is. So people innovate during war.
Yeah, you brought up space there, but you touched on space, and that is something that you're possibly one of the biggest space advocates in Parliament, and you chair the all-party Parliamentary Space Committee. Where did your initial interest in space start? What sort of got you into it? Did you watch Star Trek, Star Wars when you were a kid, or what sort of captured your imagination about that spirit of exploration, or the applications that space has?
So it's interesting you talk about that. I mean, Star Trek is space fantasy, which is a very different thing. And actually, if you want space fiction, then Arthur C. Clarke was a great master of that. Who actually has, when Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote 2001: Space Odyssey and that kind of stuff, he was part of the kind of the space race. He was part of sort of advising. I think it was NASA in terms of what can and can't be done. But he was very clever in terms of what he came up with. And there are still things, I think, geosynchronous satellites was an concept he came up with. Also satellite comms, where you have 3 satellites around the globe that they can see each other past the horizon. All of this kind of stuff was him. So my interest, I mean, look, I always wanted to be a mechanical engineer actually, but my maths was so terrible that the only thing left for me was investment banking, having failed to go into university. So I left school and been much around for a bit, and then started investment banking when I was 19, and kind of the rest is sort of well documented. But I've always had an interest. When I've got a pilot's license, so I've always been interested in aerospace and what you can do. And so my interest in engineering, my father was very into motorsport and cars. He was editor of Autocar magazine, and so I was brought up sort of having a fascination in that. But I've had an interest in, as I say, in aerospace. And when I got here, one of the challenges, I mean, it's just interesting stuff.
I mean, it's very inspiring. The thought of not just the sort of technological applications, but also going out to different planets and star systems. I mean, that's a very cool thing, even if we're not there now and might not be in our life. I mean, and just briefly on this, I read that you were perhaps offered a chance to go into space.
You have done your research.
Spirit of exploration amongst the UK Parliament.
I got a call from a mate of mine who's good mates of Jeff Bezos, and he rang to sort of say, did I want to be the first member of Parliament into space? Although plenty of congressmen have actually been into space.
That's the door's open then, right? You could be the first one.
Well, to be honest,
that would be great.
I hesitated. I blinked and lost the opportunities. I don't think anybody else is going up from Parliament, but it was one of those weird things where you kind of on the one hand, I was thinking of sort of the whole thing exploding and everybody cheering when an MP gets blown up like a Roman candle, and the other side of it was I'd have to declare it. So every time you get anything worth more than like 400 quid or something, like 300 quid, you have to declare it.
This is probably slightly more than that.
$350,000. I mean,
right,
that's going to stick out like a sore thumb in the register of members' interest. So, but it's not going to happen. But look, the important point is you're right. The inspirational piece of space, and for me was when I was six years old. When Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, and do
you remember watching that?
Yes, of course, absolutely. I mean, I didn't watch it live because I think he got out of the Eagle at kind of mid-afternoon. I think it was Eastern Standard Time, so it was quite late for us. I'd have been in bed, but obviously it was on all the news channels, and kind of watched it. And of course, we've watched it 1,000 times since then. But space isn't. For most of us who have an interest in the space industry, isn't about people in space. And actually the other thing which isn't necessarily about is launch. So launch is an enabler. Launch is very spectacular, and we love launch. It's very, very... That's
the fireworks that everyone likes to see, but
well, they do.
But
it's very symbolic. So the mighty Saturn V thrusting skywards. We're going to have launch from the UK from Saxe-Ford by the end of this year.
That's in the Shetlands?
In the northern part of the Shetlands, yeah, absolutely. And so that's going to happen this year, and it's going to be fantastic. And all thanks to a guy called Frank Strang, who's really sort of worked his socks off to get this underway. But space is about satellites and what you can do with it. And one thing that I'm working on at the moment, which really is exciting, is the concept of space solar power. So big solar farms in space that then beam the energy back to Earth. And this is, I think it was Isaac Asimov who sort of first came up with it, I don't know, 50 or 60 years ago. But the technology has been around for a long time. So photovoltaics in space has been around since Sputnik 2 in 1958. We've had energy beaming has been around for 150 years. Nikola Tesla came up with that.
So you'd need quite a big satellite to be able to do this.
Yeah. So, but it's basic stuff. So the satellite is 3 by 2 kilometers in size.
Wow.
So it's assembled in space. So it goes up with lots.
You're basically taking a power station, putting it offshore.
You're taking a solar farm and putting it in orbit.
Right. Yeah.
So the orbit is at 36,000 kilometers. So it's always in the sunlight, and as the Earth rotates, so 36,000 kilometers, your period around the Earth is 24 hours. So therefore, you're always over the same point as the world goes round. And then on the ground you have a big antenna. So the beam is not like a laser beam that will shoot the wings off an aeroplane flying, something out of James Bond. It's a wide beam. It's about 3 kilometers across, and you have a big antenna actually at sea, and you can bring all this stuff in. But the efficiency is enormous. So the antenna to get 2 gigawatts of power, so about the same size as a nuclear power station, the antenna would be about 5% of the size of an equivalent solar farm on the ground. So it's much smaller for renewable energy, and the estimated costs are kind of 3.5 to 5 billion for a 2 gigawatt unit. So that's up in the geostationary orbit and down on the ground.
And that's something you obviously have to assemble. You have to have a number of launchers that go up and like the ISS.
Yes, but way more than that. I mean, so that weighs 200 tons. These weigh 2,000 tons.
Yeah.
But the cost is about 5 billion, and an equivalent nuclear power station would be about 15 billion. So your cost per unit is much cheaper for this. It's just a question of getting over the engineering challenge, which is how do you design something in such a way that you can get it into space and you can get the beaming right. but it's all being proved at the moment, and if people who are in it. So I chair the advisory board on a thing called the Space Energy Initiative, and we've got people like BAE Systems and Thales Athena Space and kind of big primes. A lot of universities are all involved in this, and I'm also non-executive director of the UK's lead company called Space Solar, and which is looking to commercialise this. But it's going on around the world. It all sounds terribly sort of Star Trek and that kind of sort of weird stuff, but actually if you go and take money out of a hole-in-the-wall machine, that transaction is timed by a satellite. If you want to find your way here, or you want to get to the pub later, your iPhone will talk to satellites to tell you where you are and where the nearest pub is. If you're a farmer and you want to know whether your crops are being, kind of distressed because of heat, you can look at Earth observation satellites, either visible spectrum or infrared spectrum, which looks at heat stress. You can do all sorts of things. The Ukraine war, there are infrared optical satellites which are looking at the ground, which can see a column of Russian tanks warm themselves up at 3 o'clock in the morning before going in.
Wow.
Whereas normal visible spectrum, it's in the dark.
Yeah.
So, and this is what space is all about. It's all about its communications, it's internet, it's all sorts of things.
Well, it seems like it's really becoming. You were mentioning satellite imagery over Ukraine, and just on the communication side of things, Ukraine and the Middle East are also examples where the Starlink system has been widely talked about as a major strategic and military asset that Ukraine and Israel have been sort of tapping into to help with their operations. And we don't, as the UK, don't necessarily have those same systems. Is that something we should be investing in? I mean, this is a sort of national security space, isn't it?
Potentially. I mean, well, we've got OneWeb, which is basically in competition to Starlink. So it basically does the same thing. So it does broadband communications. Our Starlink satellites, our OneWeb satellites, are about the same size as the Starlink ones, but you can put more payload. So there are certain things we could do. So we could potentially with that have a type of GPS, so sat nav, and we could also mount on these buses the sort of secure communications, military communications. But we do have that as well. I mean, we've got the Skynet array, which are actually bigger satellites at geostationary orbit, sort of focusing on one part of the ground. But there is communications with that. But you're right. I mean, you've got to be able to communicate cleverly. I mean, the interesting one is actually if you want to communicate securely, the way you do it is with lasers. So if you think of your fiber,
that sounds very cool. That sounds very space age.
Well, it is. I mean, at the moment, so satellites can talk to each other using lasers. So if you think about it, if I send a message on my mobile phone, let's say, somebody can hack into that signal and listen to it and decode it and find out what's going on. If you've got a fiber optic cable, then it's much more difficult. You can't listen to it. You've got to actually intervene to get into it, to look at the light coming through it. And the same applies with a laser. So a laser is basically fiber optics without the glass. So it's just basically firing it between two things. And that was developed, because kind of laser comms was developed to control drones, not using traditional electromagnetic spectrum, because what you don't want to do is to be able to be hacked into your drone. So you use a laser to control it, but you've got to be able to see it. It's got to be line of sight. But now people have worked out how you can do that from space to a thing on the ground. So now you can send data, huge quantities of data from a laser from the ground up to a satellite, then across to another one, and then back down to the ground again.
So, I mean, that's really intriguing. And I guess sort of what you're saying just goes to show that sometimes the legacy technology has its strengths where the, for example, the fiber optics are harder to intercept than the laser technology. I wanted to ask you about the cost side of things, because we are as the UK in the position where it's quite difficult to compete. The US, for example, spends $73 billion a year on their space program. China, $14 billion. And we have announced, the UK government's announced 10 billion over the next 10 years. But since it's such a capital-intensive industry, do you think that we can compete in a really meaningful way in this sort of new age space race?
So there's a lot of different things. So the Americans put people in space, as indeed the Russians and the Chinese would as well. So this is really expensive. It's really, really, really difficult to put people in space for a lot of different reasons. And it's a really nasty space out there. I mean, it's very, very toxic. And but if you want to do that, it's useful and it's interesting and it's innovative, but it doesn't necessarily make a huge amount of money. It's a good way of spending a lot of money. What we're doing in the UK is we want to have a space industry and we want to be very good at our space industry, but we don't necessarily want to go to that huge amount of expense of investing into rockets that will take people because of how complicated it is. So what we're looking at doing is how do you make something happen where you've got so the real problem with space is, let's say you've got a car and a satellite, right? If you want to get a car to work, you can try it out. You can take it out onto the drive outside your house, and if it doesn't work, you put it back in the garage and try again. With space, it's very difficult because the first thing is you've got to design something that can take the shock of launch, and launch is very, very brutal. And then once you've got the shock of launch, you've then got to get it into space, and if it doesn't work in space, you can't nip up there with a sort of a monkey wrench and an Allen key and try and fix it. You've got to that's it. And then you've got to deorbit it. So there's lots of things that have got to go on. So that hurdle you've got to get over needs a bit of help from somebody who's prepared to give it a bit of oomph, and that's where the government steps in with the £10 billion. So what it's looking at doing is potentially just edging along where an investor might sort of say, look, if I'll invest in this business, but I need to see greater confidence that it's going to work. And if the government takes a risk in terms of getting it or reduces the cost that you're going to lose as an investor, if it doesn't work when you get into space, then it makes it easier to raise money. But ultimately, as it comes back to my investment banking thing, is make money out of it. That's how you do it. But it is tricky at the moment. But it's going to get easier because we'll get more used to this. We'll understand more about how launch works. And I'm going down to Harwell later this week with some other parliamentarians to go and have a look at the satellite applications catapult and the space cluster down there. And it's really interesting. They've got these amazing machines which you strap your £20 million satellite to, and it vibrates it to what would shake your car to death, but it proves that satellite will work in a rocket where it gets vibrated very badly, and then it's subject to very, very high launch stress levels. These things go up very quick and accelerating very fast. It's got to work. You can't have bits falling off it or the fuse dropping out or something. It's
yeah. Well, so sort of along the similar lines to looking to the future and space, the last thing I'd like to talk to you about is AI. Right. And we are seeing, as far as technologies have developed in history, this is definitely one of the fastest developing spaces and industries that we've seen, probably surpassing the internet for its development speed. What, amongst your colleagues and UK Parliament, and what would you say is the awareness of AI, just in terms of capabilities, use cases, and potential for disruption of an economy that people in your shoes and around you are sort of aware of and attuned to? Is this something people are actively monitoring? I'm sure there are groups of people that are actively monitoring it, but on the whole, are people aware of how rapidly it's changing?
So I think amongst parliamentarians, there's kind of an awareness that it's a thing, but I think, and I think also there is an awareness that you can have sort of quite hostile things done. As an MP, you can have deepfake films of you doing things which is going to cause quite interesting problems. We're coming up to a general election this year, which is going to be quite brutal.
and it'll be interesting to see kind of what happens in terms of deepfake that comes out about MPs, and I suspect there will be some challenges, and from hostile nations, Russians or Koreans or whatever. But look, the technology is moving forward quite quickly, and AI can do an awful lot of stuff. I mean, I've started to become aware of the energy demands for AI. I mean, people are talking about astonishing amounts of energy needed to drive these computers to do, for AI to kind of build itself, and it starts getting sort of slightly alarming.
Do you think you'll use AI as part of the creation of legislation and in the legislative process? Do you think, like, when do you see that coming in, either as an assistant, or maybe one day in the future, like, you have AI lawmakers? What
we could have AI interviewers, Charlie. The two of us.
Maybe I could be out of a job.
Like, yeah, you and I both. Your AI interviewer machine replacement can interview my AI replacement. I mean, the answer is I don't know. I mean, I think again we're sort of slightly going down the route of sort of slightly sort of Star Trek. But having said that, Star Trek first. If you look back at some of these sort of things in the 1960s, where they had people wandering around with these little pads, that's an iPhone by another name. Or an iPad. There are the amount we've got. So here's statistics I was given a few years ago, so it'll be out of date by now. But the amount of if you would go back to the 1950s and build a computer that had the same capability of your iPhone, it would be built in a building that would be square 3 kilometres by 3 kilometres by 100 stories. That's how big the building would need to be for that type of thing. And now you slip it into your pocket. There is more computer technology in your toaster, or indeed, sorry, not your toaster, in the key fob that unlocks your car, than there was in Apollo 11 when it went to the moon.
Wow. Wow.
This is the thing. So computers have just come forward in leaps and bounds, and AI is a kind of next iteration. Charlie, it's your generation. You're going to have to sort this out. I'm 61. You're what, 24, 5, something, and you as the next generation of legislators are going to have to work out what you want to do with it. I'm open-minded about it. I think it's a good thing. It's the next progression. We've all seen that Arnold Schwarzenegger film. What was it called?
Terminator.
Terminator. Yeah, we've all seen Terminator several times, and that's kind of AI in the future where you can see it going wrong. I mean, somebody actually, kind of a futurist, sort of came up with a very interesting idea, and they sort of said, AI may not be hostile. AI may be really nice, and actually think what it needs to do to human beings is to make them feel nice and comfortable. Therefore, plug them into a nice warm bath and inject heroin into them the whole time. So because that's kind of arguably gives you a nice feeling. I gather. But so you don't know what it's going to interpret. I mean, but I think ultimately it's going to be complicated. But our generation has grown. My generation has grown up sort of moving from the Commodore PET and sort of
I'm assuming that's a computer. Is that a computer?
You assume correctly.
Okay.
Yeah. So but my parents. I mean, my father had absolutely no idea the concept of an iPhone. I mean, he would be 106 if he was still alive, but he just couldn't get his head around an iPhone or even a mobile telephone.
How do we protect, for example, we're so reliant in this country on the City of London, the financial sector. How do we seek to protect that from? I mean, AI's applications and use cases now are really geared towards data analysis and projection and calculation, which is a lot of what finance is. And how do we, I guess, ensure for either the next generation of people going into the financial services industry or just industries in general that require those skill sets, how do we protect both one of the bedrocks of our economy, but also that labor force going forward against the disruptive effects of AI?
It's a very good question, but the same applies for absolutely everything. I mean, and I think ChatGPT has been getting 86% in its medical finals, isn't it?
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, the bottom line is it's a real challenge for everybody, I think. So look, as I say, it's a generational thing. You know, the next I mean, obviously we have to be very careful about that. And in fact, if you look at the markets, I mean, there's always been this sort of holy grail of being able to predict how markets work. And, you know, there are all sorts of clever things. I mean, we've had algorithmic trading going on for a long time. We've had Bayesian probability black boxes running hedge funds. You know, kind of if something happens over here, what does that mean for 20 other things around it? And they can trade the whole time and sort of automatically trade. You know, this is just AI is going to put that on steroids. But eventually what you get is a perfect market where the share price or the value of everything reflects everything that is, you know, the strong form of the perfect market theory is that a share price or an asset price reflects everything that is known, that isn't known, and is yet to be known about a publicly known, privately known, and yet to be known.
So it's a big spotlight. It's sort of shining the light and uncovering basically. You know, if we have sort of perfect knowledge, it ensuring fairness, I guess, right?
Yeah, maybe, or unfairness. I mean, you know, you're kind of people are instinctively competitive and they want to do better. If everybody has the same bit of AI,
so maybe fairness in value or fairness in valuation, but perhaps unfairness in access to that valuation or even access to. You know, how we value and how we look at different companies through prisms that the prism of AI that, you know, we previously takes into account so many factors that a human just wouldn't be able to. We have a far clearer outlook on what, you know, what a company's real value or health might be.
But I mean, a company. Why would you have humans running a company?
That's a good question.
So
I mean,
you end
maybe we won't at some point. Maybe it will just be,
sure.
You know, an iPhone will be a company, will be running itself.
What are we going to do? Listen, I'm going to be retiring soon.
Yeah.
Actually, hope
not too soon. Not too soon.
But it's but look, I mean, at the end of the day, you know, you're the same age, you know, slightly a year or two older than my kids. You know, I look at your generation. I don't see any sense that, you know, people want to know that there is a thing called AI and they want to use it. But people are competitive. You know, people come up and think up new ways. I mean, your generation has been extraordinary how it's imagined new ways of making money. You know, you create, Twitter, whatever it's called now, X, and suddenly you've got a whole lot of social media influencers on Instagram and whatever else it is you look at, TikTok, although I'm slightly worried about TikTok and its China algorithm sort of coming through. But it's but there's all this you know, amazing stuff that has come along and your generation has worked out how to live with it and use it to your advantage. I don't see that AI is going to take over the world and make everybody redundant and sit around, you know, staring at the wall. People will find other ways of you know, doing clever things, and maybe this is going to be an opportunity where the next generation becomes competitive in different ways. So maybe more sport or more art or any number of different things. But as I say, human nature is ambitious. You know, we're reaching for the stars. We're reaching for, you know, we're doing stuff in space. We've still got the deeps to look at. You know, kind of the deep oceans, and those are completely unexplored.
I mean, it's an uncertain but fascinating future. I think that's a good note to end on. So thank you very much for your time, Mark, and it was absolutely great to have you here.
Charlie, it's been a great pleasure.